What if the final words on Dark Side of the Moon, the last human voice you hear on one of the best-selling albums in the history of the world? An album that has sold somewhere past 50 million copies and sat in the charts for decades. Do not belong to Roger Waters or to David Gilmour or to any member of Pink Floyd at all. What if they belonged to a middle-aged Irishman who worked at the studio as a caretaker and a doorman? A man whose job was to open the building in the morning and keep it running. A man with no record contract and no fame and no reason whatsoever to end up as the closing voice on a masterpiece. That is not a clever framing. It is simply the truth. And it is one of the most quietly radical decisions on an album full of radical decisions. Because Pink Floyd, at the height of their powers, chose to give the last word on their album about the human mind, not to a star, but to the man who swept their floors. This is the story of Jerry O'Driscoll, and of why his voice, and not a more famous one, was the right one to end the record. To understand how a doorman ended up speaking the final lines of Dark Side of the Moon, you have to understand the strange method by which the band gathered the human voices that haunt the album. Pink Floyd did not write these spoken parts. They did not hand actors a script. Instead, they prepared a set of cards, each one printed with a question, and the questions went straight for the largest things a person can be asked. Are you afraid of dying? Do you ever think you are going mad? When was the last time you were violent? And were you in the right? They took these cards around Abbey Road and handed them to whoever was present, staff and friends and crew and passing musicians, and they recorded the answers without warning and without rehearsal. The entire point was to catch something that could not be performed. Waters wanted candor, the unguarded truth of a real human being confronted with a real question and given no time to compose a clever response. He was not looking for wit. He was looking for the thing people say before they have time to decide what they ought to say. And that single requirement, spontaneity over polish, truth over performance, turned out to be the hidden law that decided whose voice made the album and whose did not. Jerry O'Driscoll passed that test without even knowing it was a test. He was, by every account, exactly what he appeared to be. A working man, an Irish caretaker at the studio, the kind of person who is physically present in the making of famous records every single day, and who never, under any normal circumstance, ends up on one. He was handed the cards, and he answered them the way such a man answers, plainly, without strategy, without any awareness that what he was saying would outlive almost everyone in the building. And what came out of him was not clever. It was something better than clever. Asked about death, he gave an answer of such flat, unforced acceptance that it became one of the most quoted spoken passages in rock. The calm declaration of a man who simply was not afraid of dying, who saw no reason to be, who understood that everyone has to go at some point and treated that fact as ordinary rather than terrifying. There is no performance in it. There is no fear and no bravado either. There is just a man telling the truth about mortality as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And on an album obsessed with the terror of the mind coming apart, that plainness lands like cool water. And then there is the ending. After 40 minutes of music about everything that grinds a human being down, time and money and pressure and the slow approach of madness, after the last great swell of the closing track rises and falls, the album does not end on a chord or a lyric or a band member's voice. It ends on Jerry O'Driscoll. His is the last human sound on the record, a quiet remark, delivered in a soft Irish accent, to the effect that there is no dark side of the moon at all, that as a matter of fact the whole thing is dark. Sit with what that means as a choice. The entire album is built around the metaphor of the dark side, the hidden region of the self where madness and fear live. And at the very end, the band lets the caretaker dissolve the metaphor with a single, unrehearsed observation: the idea that the division into light and dark is an illusion, that it is all dark, that there is no safe lit side to retreat to. It is the most profound line on the album, the philosophical key to the whole thing. And it was spoken by a man who was not trying to be profound, who was simply answering a card, and whose name almost nobody who loves this record could tell you. Now here is the part that turns a charming piece of trivia into something with a real edge. Because the same sessions that immortalized the Doorman also caught a far more famous voice and threw it away. While Pink Floyd were making Dark Side of the Moon at Abbey Road, another act was recording in the same building at the same time. It was Wings, the band led by Paul McCartney, one of the two most famous musicians alive, a former Beatle, a man whose voice was known to literally hundreds of millions of people. And Pink Floyd, going around with their cards, recorded him too. Paul and Linda McCartney both answered the questions. By any logic of fame, a spoken contribution from a Beatle would have been a coup, the kind of guest appearance that record companies dream about. And the band cut it. They listened to what the most famous man in the building had given them, and they decided it was useless, because he had done the one thing the method could not tolerate. He had performed. He had been guarded, careful, conscious of the microphone, trying, in Waters' own later complaint, to be funny rather than true. The Beatle treated the question as a stage. The Doorman treated it as a question. And so the Doorman stayed on the album and the Beatle was erased from it, which may be the purest demonstration in all of rock of what Pink Floyd actually valued. It is worth pausing on how complete that inversion is, because it is not a one-off accident. The same album kept the unrehearsed remarks of caretakers and crew and their wives, ordinary people caught telling the truth, and discarded the contribution of the single most celebrated musician who happened to be within reach. The engineer, Alan Parsons, who shaped the sound of the entire record, offered an answer to one of the cards and admitted he could not come up with anything interesting, and his contribution was cut too. Fame did not buy a place on this album. Polish did not buy a place. The only currency that worked was unguarded honesty, and that currency was held, as it so often is, by the people with the least status in the room. The man who opened the door and the man who swept the studio were richer in it than the Beatle and the master engineer combined. And the album knew it, and the album chose accordingly. That choice is the whole reason this small story matters, because it tells you something true about where honesty actually lives, and why we're so bad at finding it. We assume profundity belongs to the famous and the credentialed, that the deepest things said on a record will come from the artist, the genius, the name on the cover. Dark Side of the Moon quietly argues the opposite. It suggests that the truest words about death and madness are most likely to come from someone who has not been taught to perform them, someone who has not built a public self that has to be protected, someone who, when asked the largest question a person can be asked, simply answers it. Jerry O'Driscoll was not wiser than Paul McCartney. He was just less rehearsed, and on the subject of mortality, less rehearsed turned out to be the same thing as more honest. The album is a machine for detecting that difference, and it detected it perfectly, keeping the Doorman and dropping the star. So the next time you reach the end of the Dark Side of the Moon, the moment when the music finally subsides and one last quiet voice speaks over the fading heartbeat, listen to who it actually is. It is not the band signing off. It is GERRY O'Driscoll, the caretaker of Abbey Road, a working Irishman with no stake in the music and no idea that his offhand remark would become the final word of one of the most listened-to records ever made. Telling the truth about the dark in a soft accent, while somewhere in the same building, the tape of a Beatle trying to be clever was being quietly set aside. The most famous album about the human mind ends with the voice of the man who opened the door. And that, more than any lyric on it, is the album telling you exactly what it believes. If you want the rest of these hidden figures, the caretakers and roadies and session voices who shaped Pink Floyd's greatest records while their names stayed in the shadows, that whole secret history is the spine of my Pink Floyd dossier. And the link is waiting in the pinned comment. But the heart of it is in this one decision, a Doorman kept and a Beatle cut. So I will leave you the question the ending of this album has been asking, quietly, for half a century. When a record about everything that destroys the mind goes looking for the truth and finds it in the man who sweeps the floor rather than in the most famous musician alive, what is that record really telling us about where honesty lives? And why are we always so surprised by the answer? Where art does not console, it autopsies.